Good morning. So I split up the causes of the Civil War lesson into two parts. Remember, going back to our lesson objectives, we were going to look at some of the major things that help lead to the cause of the war. But one of the other things we're going to look at is the major events that took place that led up to the Civil War. So to review from yesterday's notes, you have several things occur from 1850 to 1861 that lead to the beginning of the American Civil War. The first is a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin to depict the true, cruel face of slavery. Its publication inflamed anti slavery sentiment in the North. It became very popular. It became one of the most widely read novels in the North. In the South, the book was actually banned for obvious reasons. And when President Lincoln finally met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he reportedly said, "So this is the little lady who made this big war." So going forward to other events that help lead to the war, you have Harriet Beecher Stowe right there. She was actually from Connecticut, and as I said yesterday, had never traveled to the South. So she was taking all of this information from what she had heard from people who were runaway slaves themselves, describing their experiences. There were a lot of scenes from Uncle Tom's Cabin that depicted the harsh treatment that slaves faced, and how some of the most terrible things was them being separated from their families and sold into slavery. Then the next major event that really will have significance in terms of the Supreme Court was the case Dred Scott versus Sanford. So in 1857, Dred Scott is a slave who travels north with his master. And once he's in the North, he's in a free state. He's in the free state of Illinois. He sues his master for his freedom. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which again is the highest court in the land. And in this court decision, the Supreme Court declared that slaves were not citizens and that Dred Scott did not even have the right to use the federal court system to sue for his freedom. The other thing that the Supreme Court does is it declares that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, that Congress did not have the authority to prohibit slavery or outlaw slavery in the territories. What this decision did is basically it said that slavery could exist everywhere and the government did not have the power to stop it. Now, why this was so significant is you have most of the Supreme Court justices or the judges that sit on the Supreme Court, they were Southerners. They were pro-slavery. So where you're an abolitionist like Frederick Douglass thinking that, we're getting closer and closer to the idea of freedom, this case totally travels that back and says, nope, not a thing. Slavery should actually exist everywhere. So this was devastating to the abolitionist movement. This later will be overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendments that's passed after the end of the Civil War. In 1854, as again, this big thing about westward expansion, the country is continually moving west. So now we have territories that are growing in population. They want to become states. As the country is growing west, we're also trying to grow the railroad that's going to connect the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country all the way to California. So this debate begins whether or not the railroad should exist in the north or the south as a starting point, and this led to an argument over slavery in the new territories. The act organized Nebraska as a territory, and to win Southern support, proposed another state inclined to support slavery, Kansas. Each was going to be allowed to decide the issue of slavery themselves based on that popular sovereignty you saw in Lesson 1 yesterday. So each territory or each state, Kansas and then Nebraska, are going to vote whether they are a slave state or whether they are a free state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act officially overturns the expansion or overturns the ban of the Missouri Compromise. And that's the significance of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that slavery would now be decided based on what the people wanted, not based on a demarcation line like we saw in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. So the Transcontinental Railroad going from east to west is completed in 1869, and you can see the territories that it travels across on the top map here. Many of these are Indian lands, many of these are desert, but now we officially have a railroad that connects Kansas City, Missouri, all the way to California. But what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is now going to cause is it's going to cause a severely violent situation in these two areas. Northerners, many abolitionists, many from Massachusetts, actually rushed to Kansas, moving to Kansas in the middle of the country to create an anti-slavery majority. Abolitionists, again, are people that believe slavery should be outlawed. People living in Missouri along the Missouri border also rushed into Kansas to vote for a pro-slavery legislature. So what ultimately ends up happening is you have this division. You have these people living in Kansas that are very violently against slavery, and you have people living in Kansas that are very pro-slavery. So two governments end up being created. One is anti-slavery, one is pro-slavery. And now we are set for a clash. You have a group of pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri who are clashing with Jayhawkers. Those are known as people who want to create a free state. And you have violence break out. So one of the questions on your guided notes is, what is the significance? So what you'll have over the next several years are violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. So there's a question on your guided notes. What was Bleeding Kansas? Bleeding Kansas and its importance marks the first violence that breaks out between people because of slavery. And many people consider what happens in Kansas to kind of be the first time. It's like the beginnings of the Civil War. We don't really like call it the Civil War, but it definitely signified that like the issue of slavery was going to be something that people were willing to kill each other over. So that was what Bleeding Kansas was all about. Okay, so there is a YouTube video I will link that describes further Bleeding Kansas. In a later raid in Lawrence, Kansas, Confederate guerrillas killed 200 people and caused $2 million worth of damage in an anti-slavery settlement. Okay, so then you have a man come along named John Brown. John Brown is an abolitionist, and John Brown believes that God chose him to single-handedly end slavery. So he makes a radical plan to put an end to slavery in the South. He's going to capture a military armory, which is where guns, ammunition, things are taking place. Once he captures this armory, he'll be able to organize and give slaves the arms they need so they would revolt and gain their own freedom. He tries to do this in 1859. He tries to take over a federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The attempt fails. Brown actually loses all 5 of his sons during the raid. He's captured, he's convicted of treason, and hanged to death. So despite the failure of John Brown's planned slave revolts, he becomes a martyr for the abolitionist cause. A martyr is somebody that like they look up to, somebody to like to devote themselves to, that this is the cause. Although many in the North didn't agree with his violent actions, they did agree with his belief that slavery should be abolished. His actions convinced many Southerners that abolitionists wanted to kill all slaveholders. So he kind of becomes this radical person where, is he a freedom fighter? Is he somebody that we should look up to, or is he a terrorist? I'll also link this video on the assignment so that you can decide for yourselves. Do you consider himself to be a terrorist that was meant to terrorize people, or to be a freedom fighter? So he says, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. And he was right. 620,000 people will perish in the coming Civil War. But he knew, even though he was killed before the Civil War begins, that this issue of slavery will not be decided but without bloodshed. So think about your position. I asked you this question yesterday, but now having a little more information, do you think the Civil War was inevitable? This is your opinion. So either yes, it was inevitable, meaning it was going to happen, there was nothing that could happen to stop it, and why. So use some of the evidence from these last two lessons to defend your position.